A tow request may be the most disputed few minutes in the Nolan Wells case. A young man on a boat near Horn Island called for help, describing rising water, failed equipment, roughly 7 people aboard, and a vessel that needed assistance. Then, almost immediately, the boat owner's grandfather contacted the tow captain and said the help was no longer necessary. That timing has become fuel for an extraordinary theory, that the mechanical emergency was never the real emergency at all. But the theory arrives with a serious problem. Some of the most explosive claims attached to it are not established facts. They come from disputed audio enhancements, online interpretation, changing recollections, and assumptions about people whose guilt has not been proven. So I want to follow the case in the order the evidence actually becomes useful, not the order that makes the loudest accusation sound strongest. By the end, there is one question we have to answer. Does the record we have justify a cover-up conclusion, or does it justify something narrower, a demand for a fuller investigation before anyone decides what happened to Nolan? That distinction matters because the public conversation has already raced ahead of the official findings. The phrase accusing Bart Edmiston Jr. of killing Nolan has circulated widely, often paired with a theory about jealousy, race, a young woman named Katie, and an alleged struggle on or around the boat. Some commentators have gone further, suggesting family influence, a manufactured alibi, and intervention by older adults who supposedly understood how to create a paper trail after a fatal event. None of that has been established in the account before us. What is established in that account is more complicated. Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. He became separated from the group. His phone remained with people who returned to the mainland. The boat experienced a mechanical problem and a tow call was placed. Nolan was later found dead. An independent autopsy described both cause and manner as undetermined pending further investigation. And by mid-August, his family and attorneys were publicly pressing for a transparent phone examination and federal review. Those facts create room for hard questions. They do not create permission to turn a theory into a verdict. The family also challenged early public statements that there was no indication of foul play while the cause of death remained unresolved, arguing that reassurance arrived before the underlying medical and digital questions had been exhausted. That is the line this case keeps crossing in public, and it is also the line we have to keep rebuilding. The issue is not whether suspicion is allowed, it is whether suspicion is being updated when evidence weakens one claim and strengthens another. The first major distortion came from a photograph. Online users circulated an older image of Bart standing beside a young woman and identified her as Katie. From there, the image became the foundation for a motive story. Bart supposedly had a prior relationship with Katie, saw Nolan with her, became jealous, and attacked him. The allegation gained emotional force because it connected several charged ideas at once: romance, race, status, and violence. Then Bart's attorney challenged the premise. He said the woman in the photograph was not Katie at all, but a different acquaintance, and described the identification as fabricated. If that correction is accurate, one of the most repeated pieces of supposed motive evidence collapses before the rest of the theory even begins. That doesn't resolve Nolan's death. It does show how quickly one bad identification can harden into a narrative. This is where I think the public discussion became dangerous. A false photograph does not prove every suspicion is false. But once a theory survives after one of its central factual supports is removed, the burden should increase, not decrease. The next claim has to be better supported than the last one. Instead, attention shifted to audio. An enhanced version of the tow call circulated online, and some listeners said they could hear phrases resembling Nolan's name, a command to wake up, a question about whether someone was dead, and a phrase interpreted as addressing Bart. The friends have denied that interpretation. The audio has not been authenticated in the account we have as a reliable record of those alleged words. Yet the disputed phrases were repeatedly treated as though they were a clean recording of a confession scene. That leap matters. Audio enhancement can make uncertain sound feel definite, because the listener is told what to expect before hearing it. Once a phrase is planted in your mind, ambiguous noise can begin to sound exactly like it. I'm not saying the audio is meaningless. I'm saying it cannot carry more weight than its authentication allows. A second line of suspicion focused on Warren Hudson's later description of the evening after the group returned. He said he went upstairs and spoke with one of the fathers about boats, while others remained downstairs. After coming back down, he described the group asking where Nolan was. Commentators argued that the upstairs conversation sounded unnecessary and therefore suspicious. They suggested it may have been used to coordinate a story or create an alibi. That is an inference, not a fact. There is no independent proof in the account that the conversation was about concealment. Still, the detail became important because it landed beside other disputed points. When the group realized Nolan was missing, who had his phone, what they believed had happened to him, and why the first explanation to his mother was that he had stayed on the island with a girl. Now add Bart's silence while other friends spoke publicly, his athletic profile, and the claim that he had more to lose than the others. Some commentators portrayed that as motive for a cover-up. A criminal charge, they argued, could destroy a future in football and damage a prominent family's reputation. His attorney's role was also interpreted by critics as evidence that powerful people were closing ranks. But hiring a lawyer to answer public accusations is not evidence of homicide. Neither is declining to join a media tour, and a university coach saying a player had not been identified as a suspect is not, by itself, proof of institutional protection. These facts may shape public perception. They do not establish criminal conduct. The same caution applies to claims that the short boat video was staged. Some people suggested the group could have recreated the scene after the fact, but the account offers no proof that happened. A clip can be too weak to exonerate without becoming evidence of staging. That middle position is less dramatic, but it is more accurate. So here is the first information gap that matters more than any viral clip. Which parts of the public theory still stand when the incorrect photograph, disputed audio, and motive assumptions are removed? If you had to separate this case into verified fact, reasonable question, and unsupported accusation, where would you place the tow call? That distinction is worth arguing about, because everything that follows depends on it. The case did not stay inside local reporting. By the account's own timeline, it moved through social media commentary, long-form interviews, nationally recognized television discussion, lawyers' press conferences, university statements, and eventually congressional attention. Former police officer and online commentator Brandon Tatum interviewed several of the participants from the boat trip. Nancy Grace later challenged some of the claims made during discussion of the case, particularly claims about polygraph testing, phone access, and what investigators supposedly knew. Attorneys representing Nolan's family included Ben Crump and other counsel who publicly argued for a transparent, jointly observed forensic process. BART's side retained counsel to address what it described as defamatory accusations. The University of Wyoming became part of the public conversation because BART was a player there, and the head coach said he had not been a suspect based on information known to the program. The family's press conference at the NABJ convention in Atlanta added another layer. The Congressional Black Caucus had requested federal attention, and a letter sought a written response within 7 days. The family also pointed to public support and reward efforts associated in the account with Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, Terrell Owens, Byron Allen, and others. That level of attention creates pressure in both directions. It can force agencies to explain themselves. It can also reward the most dramatic theory before the evidence is ready. And once national figures, attorneys, creators, and television personalities are all discussing the same death, a small inconsistency can become a headline, while a careful correction barely travels. The legal fight over speech became part of the story too. Ben Crump publicly defended the right of creators, independent journalists, and citizens to ask responsible questions about a matter of public concern. He drew a boundary between knowingly spreading false claims and examining inconsistencies or demanding transparency. The account also says parents connected to some of the young men threatened legal action over accusations being circulated. That conflict is revealing. Public scrutiny can be necessary, while defamation can still be real. Both principles can exist at the same time. There were also reward announcements and calls for anyone with information to come forward. Those efforts widened the potential witness pool, but they raised the stakes around rumor as well. When money, national attention, and online notoriety surround a case, investigators have to separate first-hand memory from people repeating what they have already heard. This is why scale is not the same thing as certainty. The case became enormous in public before the central forensic questions were settled, but the size of the coverage can hide the person at the center of it. Nolan was not introduced to the people closest to him as a mystery. He was a son, a friend, a former football player, and a young man with routines that his family believed they understood well. That ordinary familiarity is important because several of the earliest disputes in this case are really disputes about what Nolan would or would not normally do. His mother, Christine, rejected the first explanation she received that night. She said Warren called around 11:07 p.m. and told her Nolan had met a girl named Katie and decided to stay behind on the island. To Christine, that did not sound like her son. The reason was not that she believed he would never talk to a young woman. It was the idea that he would casually separate from the people he came with, remain on a remote island, and do so while leaving behind the device he constantly used. The phone detail became personal very quickly. Nolan's parents described him as someone who kept his phone close, even using it to tease his father in the morning by putting the camera near his face while he woke up. That is a tiny family detail, almost silly on its own. But this is how people recognize one another. They remember habits. Other people can explain why a phone might stay on a boat near salt water. His parents can still say that leaving it behind felt wrong for Nolan. Both observations can exist at once. The friends gave a different picture. They said leaving phones on the boat was common that day because people were getting into murky salt water and did not want to damage expensive devices. They described many phones sitting on the dashboard, perhaps around 15, including Nolan's and other people's. They said Nolan had been to Horn Island with them before, that the July 4th outing was part of a familiar social tradition, and that moving between boats or catching a ride with someone else was normal in their boating circle. That matters too. If Nolan had repeatedly visited Horn Island with these friends, then the idea of taking another ride back was not necessarily as reckless to them as it sounded to his mother. They described the area as crowded with friends, acquaintances, and many other boaters. They said someone could arrive on one boat and return on another without much planning. Yet there is a specific conflict over Nolan's final moments with the group. Warren's account describes Wyatt urgently telling Nolan to get aboard because the boat was taking on water. Nolan, in that version, declined, smiled, indicated he wanted to stay with a girl, and said he had another way back. But Katie's recollection, relayed through her sister in the account, was different. She believed Nolan was preparing to leave with the same group, and did not expect them to depart without him. Both versions cannot describe the same moment in exactly the same way. That does not tell us who is lying. Memory can shift, people can misunderstand gestures, and a crowded shoreline is not a controlled interview room. But it makes the separation point one of the most important factual questions in the entire timeline. If investigators can establish which vessel Nolan intended to board, who last saw him after that, and whether any independent witness saw him later, the case changes. His clothing became another unexpectedly revealing detail. The group initially struggled over whether his swim trunks were black or very dark blue. A photograph taken that day was later used to settle the description. The recovered body was reported as still wearing blue swim trunks. Some people treated the friends' uncertainty as suspicious because they could describe boat mechanics in detail, yet hesitated over something as basic as clothing. Others would say dark navy and black are easy to confuse during a long, chaotic day. I think the more useful point is not that forgetting a color proves anything. It is that small details became evidence substitutes because the central timeline was still incomplete. The public started measuring credibility through swim trunk color, phone habits, tone of voice, and who remembered which conversation first. That happens when the decisive evidence is missing or unreleased. Nolan's relationships were also contested publicly. The friends pushed back against suggestions that they were barely acquainted with him. They said he stayed at their homes, joined them on repeated trips, and was known by their families. That rebuttal was delivered with frustration, sometimes directed toward Nolan's parents in a way critics found disrespectful. The tone became another argument layered on top of the facts. But grief does not become clearer because strangers score everyone's tone. The better question is what these relationships can establish. If Nolan regularly stayed with these friends, there may be more messages, photographs, location data, and witnesses capable of showing his patterns before July 4th. If he regularly went to Horn Island, there may be people beyond the immediate group who knew how he behaved there. That is the kind of context that can be tested. And that brings the story back to Nolan himself. The public has spent enormous energy deciding what other people might have done. He deserves at least as much energy devoted to reconstructing what he actually did, where he moved, who saw him, when he last communicated, and what his digital record shows. A person is more than the gap left after he disappears. The investigation has to rebuild his path, not just build theories around everyone else. Therefore, the family's early actions matter because they show how quickly that gap became terrifying. Christine said she tried calling Nolan around 8 p.m. and again close to 10:48 p.m. When Warren finally called after 11, she was already worried. He told her Nolan had stayed behind and that the group had his phone. She did not accept reassurance. Her response, in essence, was simple. This was her child, and she was going to worry. She began contacting agencies. The Department of Marine Resources was one stop. The Coast Guard and Ocean Springs Police entered the chain as jurisdiction questions bounced the family from one place to another. At one point, they were told a report had to be made in person. They stopped at a hospital and asked if Nolan had arrived. They went to the police station. They were redirected again. Eventually, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office took information from them after midnight in a McDonald's parking lot. The family later described that response as lacking urgency. As far as they knew, no search boats went out that night. The next morning, Nolan's former high school football coach offered access to a boat, and family members went to the island themselves. They walked the shoreline and searched. They also said their mobile phones worked during that trip, which later became part of the dispute over claims that reception around Horn Island was extremely unreliable. This was the emotional low point before the public theories took over. A family believed their son was missing on an island, struggled to find the agency that would take responsibility, and then went onto the water themselves the next morning. No viral audio is needed to make that painful. If you want to follow the next decisive development in this case, the joint examination of Nolan's phone and any federal response are the pieces to watch. Subscribe for the update, because those results could clarify several arguments that public debate cannot settle by itself. The return of Nolan's belongings created another set of conflicting stories. The family said a friend encountered resistance when trying to retrieve the phone, and that police involvement became necessary. The friends later said the phone was handed over at the house without difficulty. They described a large group arriving in several vehicles, entering the residence, demanding answers, asking for the boat's location, and obtaining Wyatt's address. They said the atmosphere was confrontational, but that Nolan's phone was surrendered while people were still inside. The keys produced a similar disagreement. Nolan's father or stepfather returned later and asked for them. The person at the house initially said he could not find them. Another individual, communicating with someone who had been there earlier, said the keys were on top of an Xbox. The friends said they were located almost immediately after that clue and handed over. The family interpreted the initial failure to produce them as another false statement in a night already filled with contradictions. Then there was the first description of Nolan's shorts. The family said they were initially told black, only for a photograph to show a dark blue or blue-gray color. The friends said the difference was an understandable memory error made while everyone was panicking. They eventually used the photograph to correct it. None of these disputes proves how Nolan died, but together they explain why trust deteriorated so quickly. One side heard changing answers about where Nolan stayed, why he did not have his phone, where his keys were, and what he was wearing. The other side felt accused while trying to explain a chaotic day and insisted that ordinary mistakes were being turned into evidence of guilt. The family's public position later became more procedural. They said in substance that they wanted one transparent examination of Nolan's phone with all relevant experts present. The phrase that best captures their position is short: "We know our child." That conviction is not forensic proof. It is why they refuse to accept an incomplete explanation. But the timeline of July 4 still has to work without emotion carrying it. The group traveled to Horn Island for a crowded holiday gathering. They described Nolan as having joined similar trips before. At some point near departure, the boat they were using developed a serious water problem. The friends said water filled the bilge, reached a level that affected batteries or electronics, and made them fear the vessel was going down. They said another boat began towing them first. During that trouble, Wyatt called Sea Tow and reported their location, the rising water, the approximate number and ages of people aboard, and a need for assistance. He declined an offer to involve the Coast Guard. The account places the boat leaving the island around 4:31 p.m., being towed for roughly 2.75 miles, then regaining enough function to travel under its own power at speeds reported as high as 34 knots. It reached the dock around 5:44 p.m. The friends explained that after power returned, they could run the boat on plane with the stern plug removed, allowing moving water to draw accumulated water from the bilge. That is their mechanical explanation for how a situation described as severe could improve quickly. The missing person timeline is where the dispute sharpens. They said Nolan stayed behind voluntarily with a young woman and expected another ride. Katie's reported recollection complicates that account because she thought he was preparing to leave with his friends. The setting matters. The friends described the northwestern stretch of Horn Island as crowded, with roughly 20 to 30 people in their broader circle across several boats and many more visitors nearby. They used that crowd as an argument against deliberate violence, saying a busy July 4th beach offered too many potential witnesses. They also described boat hopping as normal, not exceptional, which is why they said Nolan's decision to stay did not initially alarm them. Then the mechanical problem compressed the timeline. Water was discovered in the bilge. The group says another boat was connected for a tow before the sea tow call was completed. Electronics were described as failing, then partially returning. The motor was trimmed, restarted, and eventually the vessel could move fast enough for their drain-on-plane technique. They left the island around 4:31 p.m., according to the GPS timing cited in the account, and reached the dock a little more than an hour later. By late evening, Nolan had not returned. His phone was with the group on the mainland. His mother began the series of calls that turned a holiday outing into a missing person case. Therefore, the investigation turns on evidence that can test those competing stories, and the tow call is one of the first pieces to examine. The caller described a vessel taking on water in about 31 feet of water near the west end of Horn Island, with around 7 people aboard and no one older than 21. Sea Tow did not ultimately perform the rescue. The request was canceled after the boat owner's grandfather contacted the captain and said assistance was no longer needed. The timing is what drove the cover-up theory. A Sea Tow representative later spoke with the captain and began explaining the membership information. The captain responded that he had just spoken to the grandfather and already knew the group no longer needed a tow. Commentators interpreted that as evidence the grandfather had been contacted before the tow process fully unfolded. They then made a much larger inference. Perhaps someone on the boat had called him because Nolan was already dead, and the supposed boating emergency was created to generate a timestamp and an innocent explanation for the crisis. There is no direct proof of that sequence in the account. It is a theory built from timing. The grandfather could have been called about a damaged family boat for exactly the reason people normally call an experienced older relative during an emergency. The cancellation could mean the mechanical problem was resolved. The absence of a Sea Tow vessel at the scene does not by itself turn the call into an alibi. Still, there are unresolved points. The degree of flooding described during the call has not been independently confirmed by the materials summarized here. The friends pointed to a short video showing the boat sitting in the water without visible panic or a body on deck. They argued that this undermines the idea that someone was dead on the vessel. But the clip is brief, lacks useful audio, and does not establish enough timing on its own to settle what was happening during the disputed call. Cell service adds another layer. The friends described reception near Horn Island as inconsistent and said some communications required repeated attempts or did not transmit until later. The family said their phones worked during the search the next morning. Neither experience proves what signal existed at one exact location and mine it on July 4th. A successful call can occur in an area with poor coverage, and a failed message can occur where another phone works. The inconsistency is worth checking through carrier records, not through certainty on either side. Then there is Nolan's phone. The friends said they did not know his passcode, never accessed his device, and simply moved it with other phones before returning it. They also rejected claims that photographs or messages had been deleted. But critics, including Nancy Grace during a later discussion, pointed out the logical problem. If they never opened the device, they cannot personally know that nothing was missing. That does not mean deletion occurred. It means the answer belongs to forensic examination. Two digital forensic specialists discussed why physical access matters. One explained that cloud accounts can preserve useful records, while the handset may contain databases and artifacts that help show deletion activity. Another explained that some platform data is time-sensitive and may disappear if legal preservation requests are not made quickly. The practical conclusion was straightforward. Examine both the phone and relevant cloud data and preserve records as early as possible. The family said it wanted that examination performed once, jointly, alongside Jackson County prosecutors, its own forensic team, and potentially the FBI present. They framed the procedure as a chain of custody safeguard rather than a refusal to cooperate. Their attorneys said they were ready to participate when authorities set the time and place. Nancy Grace separately challenged claims that the family had simply refused to hand over the phone, noting that such a conclusion had been drawn without independent confirmation. Testing claims became a theme in other areas too. Brandon Tatum at one point described the young men's cooperation in terms that sounded like polygraph testing, then clarified that he was referring to computer voice stress analysis and that Warren had not taken the same test. The correction mattered because the public had already begun treating the earlier characterization as stronger than it was. Tatum also said the friends had provided their own phones for forensic evaluation, presenting that as evidence of cooperation. Medical evidence remained unresolved as well. The family said it accepted preliminary findings from Dr. Roger A. Mitchell after his independent July 10, 2026 autopsy, which listed cause and manner as undetermined pending further investigation. The family also pointed to a reddish discoloration and missing throat structures as questions requiring further review. Some online theories connected those details to mechanical asphyxia. That conclusion was not established in the account. An undetermined finding is exactly that. A conclusion has not yet been reached. By August 13th, the family's legal team said preservation letters had been sent. An independent inquiry was underway, and federal involvement had been requested because Horn Island is federal land and because the family lacked confidence that a purely local process would answer every question. The Congressional Black Caucus letter sought a federal review and asked for a response within 7 days, including consideration of federal civil rights issues. The family and its attorneys repeatedly said they wanted truth and transparency, regardless of whom the evidence implicated or cleared. That is the strongest investigative position available here because it is testable. The phone can be examined, the tow call metadata can be compared with carrier and GPS records, the boat can be evaluated through whatever contemporaneous documentation exists. Witness accounts can be lined up by time rather than by personality. The disputed audio can be authenticated or rejected by qualified analysis. The autopsy questions can be reviewed by medical experts. Everything else is commentary until those steps produce evidence. So now we can answer the question that has been hanging over this case from the beginning. Does the record described here justify a conclusion that there was a coordinated cover-up? No, not yet. It justifies scrutiny. It justifies asking why accounts differ about Nolan's last moments on the island. Justifies examining why his phone remained with the group, what the sea-tow timing means, how severe the boat problem actually was, whether later statements match contemporaneous records, and why the medical findings remained undetermined. It justifies the family's demand for a process they can see and evaluate. It does not justify declaring a named person a killer because an online theory fits the gaps. That distinction protects more than the accused. It protects Nolan. If the public locks onto the wrong theory, every new fact gets forced into it. A corrected photograph becomes an inconvenience. Disputed audio becomes a confession. Ordinary lawyer involvement becomes proof of influence. A memory error becomes coordination. And eventually the case stops being an investigation into Nolan's death and becomes a contest over who can defend the story they chose first. The opposite mistake is just as serious. Dismissing every inconsistency because some online claims were wrong would be lazy. The incorrect Katie photograph does not erase the phone question. The uncertainty around enhanced audio does not erase the unusual tow call sequence. The friend's cooperation does not erase conflicting recollections. The family's frustration does not prove foul play, but it also does not make the unresolved forensic issues disappear. The standard has to stay the same for everyone. Evidence first, then conclusion. That means the next meaningful answers should come from records that do not care who has the better interview, the larger audience, the stronger attorney, the more promising athletic future, or the most sympathetic online following. phoneextraction.carrierdata.gps timing.contemporaneous images. Medical review. Witnesses who can be independently placed where they say they were. And if those records exonerate people who have been accused, that matters. If they expose deception, that matters too. The purpose is not to preserve a theory. The purpose is to find Nolan's path through the final hours with enough precision that speculation has less and less room to live. A family began this night trying to reach a son who did not come home. They were told he stayed behind. They learned his phone had not stayed with him. They called agency after agency. They went searching themselves. By August, they were still asking for a process they believed could be trusted. The federal request, the preservation demands, and the proposed joint phone examination all point toward the same next step. Replace argument with records wherever records can answer the question. That is where the case should remain centered. If that standard matters to you, keep the focus there. Do not turn an allegation into a fact because it is dramatic. Do not turn an unresolved question into nothing because it is inconvenient. And when the phone, the records, or federal review produce something verifiable, judge it by what it proves, not by which side predicted it first. Nolan Wells deserves an answer sturdy enough to survive the noise.